Hi, I'm Chad, and this video is to talk a little bit about assessment, mostly about assessment and learning and the relationship between assessment and learning. So assessment is one of the very first things we often think about when we're doing a course, when we're teaching or studying a course. It's the first thing we'll look at. We'll go, what are the assessments? What do I have to do? What do I have to hand up? And how do I do it and how do I go about it? And so I'd like you to have a bit of a think first about the purpose of assessment from your perspective. So why do you do assessments? There may be some very simple answers to that. So you may be thinking, I do assessments because I want to get good marks. I do assessment because I'm being told by my tutor that that's what there is. Quite often we've been conditioned into doing assessments because it's what's expected of us. But it's useful to think about our own relationship to assessment. Quite often, academics will usually design assessment or think about assessment or do assessment from the perspective of learning. So have a bit of a think about, does assessment often mean much about learning to you? What is learning for you, and what's the relationship between assessment and learning? So there are often two types of assessment. We can often categorize assessment into two types, and it's not a category, it's a continuum. I'll talk about that in a minute, but we often talk about formative and summative assessment. So formative assessment is really assessment you often do earlier in the course, and it's often to do with having less grading or less marking or less numbers associated with it. So it can often be less quantitative and more qualitative. Sometimes people think that formative assessment has no grades associated with it whatsoever. And that's true sometimes. If there is no grading, no mark, no A, B distinction, 90%, 70% associated with the assessment, you may call it a pure formative assessment. The idea of this is that it's formative, right? It helps form your learning. So it helps form you as a learner, helps form your knowledge. So that's how you can remember that it's formative assessment. So that pure idea of formative assessment is generally really quite early in a course. You'll often have no grades associated with it, and it should give you feedback. It should give you an idea of how you're going in the course and what you need to improve. So formative assessment is very much about your improvement, is about your learning. We call this assessment for learning, right? So really it's designed to support your learning, give you some feedback, and give you an idea of what you need to do in the future. So it should be critical. It might talk about what you're doing well, but it should also talk about what you could do better and give you an idea of how you need to improve in the future to get a better mark in the next iteration or the next assessment or the next stage of that course. So that's assessment for learning. We may talk about feedback in that one, but there's a, kind of a jargony word that sometimes people use where they say feed forward, right? So the idea of feed forward is not necessarily just giving information back to the student. It's about feedback that's used forward into the learning process. So you'll get some feedback from your tutor or from the academic or from the lecturer, and you should take that feedback forward into your learning process. You should really try to say, what can I do better based on this feedback? What are they saying about my performance here, about how I've done things, about how I'm going in the course to do better in future? So that's formative assessment. Now, that's the pure form of formative assessment, okay? There's also another type of assessment called summative assessment. The way we can remember the wording here is that it's a summation. It's the sum of all your work at the end of a course. So summative assessment usually happens at the end of a course. Probably the best example of a summative assessment might be an exam, for example. So a type of assessment that, in contrast to formative assessment, is usually weighted quite heavily. So exams are often weighted at 40, 50, maybe 70, traditionally even sometimes 100% of the assessment goes towards an exam, right? This is assessment of learning, right? So in contrast, where formative assessment is assessment for learning, it's assessment of learning. An exam is right at the end of a course, right? So it's not about taking that learning into that course later on in that course. It's like really at the end of a course where it says, how have you gone in this course? This is why the numerical assessment is important and the quantitative grading of the assignment is important, because it's about that assessment of learning, not assessment for learning. So what's your performance been? So it's quite suitable to have grades, numbers attached to that. So that's the pure form of summative assessment. Okay, so maybe 100% exam is probably a pure form of summative assessment. Most institutions have some policies around how heavy any individual assessment can be weighted. So many universities have a policy of 70%. It's impossible to have a single assessment piece that's worth more than 70%, and exams fall into that category. So this is why you won't find exams with being worth more than 70% in a lot of places. And a lot of places will try and reduce the weighting of an exam or a single piece of assessment down to 50 or 40%, so that you can have assessment on other pieces as well. So obviously, if it's not 100% assessed, it's not a pure summative assessment, right? There are still formative components to it. What you should be doing in a course is taking what you can from that bit of feedback, even in a summative assessment, and putting it later into your degree, into your next course and later courses that you do. Maybe later on in life, you're using that feedback and taking what you can learn into the rest of your life. So even in summative assessments, there are some formative elements. In formative assessments too, there are some summative elements as well. So, for example, you may have a formative assessment that's mostly formative, but it might be worth 5% or 2.5% or a very small amount. So if something is weighted very small, it may still be broadly formative, although it's got some grading towards it, and it is partly summative. So this assessment for learning, formative assessment, and assessment of learning, summative assessment, are not necessarily categories. They're more like a continuum. Okay, so you may say one assessment piece has formative components and another assessment piece has summative components. So when you're doing your assessments in the MBA or in any other degree, it's useful to think about where does this assessment fall in the space of the course? What's the purpose of this assessment? Is it more formative or is it more summative? Can I expect this feedback to be really constructive and something I should feed forward into the rest of my learning experience? Or is it more telling me how I've achieved in the past and kind of closing things off a little bit? Keeping in mind that this is a complex space, and so the weighting and the place of the assessment on the continuum between formative and summative might be different for any different assessment piece or any different degree or program or course. The other thing to keep in mind is that everybody's different. So different academics have different approaches to these things. Some really favour formative approaches, some favour summative approaches. Many academics, many teachers, many educators don't often talk about this very much. So they don't often have a really clear sense in their own mind of how all of this works. And they'll just have an assessment piece in there because they think it's important, because it's important to them, or it's important to the content or the discipline or the field or something like that. Students are all different as well. So some students will really appreciate the opportunity to have a formative assessment that's not worth very much, because they can get some good feedback, some good qualitative feedback, and an idea of how they need to improve for the future. Other people will kind of go, if it's not worth a mark, why is it really worth it? Where's the value proposition for me? Should I really go ahead with it? Should I work hard on it? Maybe not. So they may not hand up an assignment that's purely formatively assessed. Many academics and many students will go, well, if it's important, you should assess it. If you want students to do it, then it has to have a grade associated with it. And that's because if there's no grade associated with something, some students won't do it. So what I'd recommend you to do is not necessarily have a quick cookie cutter approach to this, or a recipe, or a really step-by-step process approach to this, but have a bit of a think about your approach to assessment, your approach to learning. How do you see learning? Is learning really for you about learning content, getting more information in your brain? Or is it more about you changing as a person? Is it more transformative? And then how does assessment feed into this? So if you think that assessment is about getting stuff into your brain, then maybe you might not see so much value in formative assessment. If you see it as an opportunity to change yourself or become a different person or reflect on yourself differently, formative assessment may be really quite important. The number one thing I would recommend, though, is to try and listen very carefully to what each individual teacher, what each individual academic says about assessment. Try and understand their perspective, their philosophy of learning around assessment. So if you've got an academic who says, I know this isn't worth grades, but it's a really important activity for you to get some feedback, that's their perspective on it, and it's probably useful to listen to that a little bit. If you've got an academic who says, we have an exam because an exam is really important because it's the only opportunity I have to get you to think on your feet and be under some pressure and know what's really in your mind, then that's their value around learning. That's their philosophy of learning, and it's important to take that into account whatever you're doing, whenever you're doing whatever you're doing in your learning activities in your course. So there's some thoughts from me on assessment and learning and the relationship between them, particularly the difference between formative and summative assessment. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope that's been useful.